Last weekend, the Democrats' extreme political rhetoric against the Trump administration and conservatives led to yet another Trump assassination attempt, and really highlighting the need for us to exclude these people from polite society, as well as showing exactly why Democrats are doing so terribly right now in the midterms of 2026 when historically they should be winning. My name is Ben Corriveau, and welcome to my show. We actually had a ton of news this week. So obviously the big news was that there was another Trump assassination attempt. And no, if you follow the news in any reasonable way, or if you're some average person actually following the news, you would realize that this is completely obvious when you have crazy leftists with their radical rhetoric, basically calling Trump and any conservative Hitler, Nazis, fascists, which is objectively untrue. But let's get into it. So we have this from the New York Post. This is actually his full manifesto. I'm not going to put it up. It'll be in my sources so you can read it yourself. It's kind of long. It's about 1,000 words. But he signed it, Cold Force Friendly Federal Assassin Allen. And he outlined his rules of engagement for the shooting, stating that he believed it was his righteous duty to target administration officials. So that's absolutely insane in the first place. And we actually had this within a few hours of the assassination attempt occurring because he sent this to his family 10 minutes before the assassination attempt occurred. And so that was obviously big news because we had that. But the Democrats decided that that wasn't good enough, and they couldn't skew it anyway, so they decided to lie about it. I mean, right here we have from Barack Obama. He's basically the head of the Democrat Party. I mean, I know he's been out of the picture for a bit, but he's still somewhat active in terms of helping other people get elected. But here you can see in his post, he says, "We don't yet have the details about the motives behind last night's shooting." This was hours, I believe it was six or 7 hours after the manifesto was released. So no, we did have the evidence. And maybe Obama didn't see it. I highly doubt that because he's quite connected. I mean, obviously he was a former president. So I'm extremely I'm nearly 100% convinced that he did this to lie and try to deceive people into believing that this was just another crazy person. But if you believe any of the statistics, they're going to say he was a conservative, which there's no evidence of. But this whole situation was just so despicable from the left, their reaction to it, because obviously you had a bunch of people celebrating it, saying that they wish that he had killed Trump, which is absolutely insane. But in addition to that, right before this happened, actually, we had Jimmy Kimmel. He had a fake White House Correspondents' Dinner several days before the assassination attempt, where he made this joke.
And of course, our First Lady Melania is here. Look at Melania, so beautiful. Mrs. Trump, you have a glow like an expectant widow.
And I should have put up air quotes when I said joke, because obviously that wasn't a joke. I don't know who would think that calling somebody an expectant widow is funny unless you're absolutely despicable. But that's obviously who Jimmy Kimmel is. I mean, he's been doing this for years now. Pretty much his whole shtick is that he's anti-Trump. And if you follow me on social media, I called him out on this. Because he's supposed to be a comedian, and comedy is supposed to bring people together, not divide people. But Jimmy Kimmel doesn't care. He's not a comedian. I mean, he hasn't been funny in years. And what he does say now is almost completely politically charged, all anti-Trump. It doesn't matter what he says as long as it's anti-Trump, because that's where the ratings are, right? So that was absolutely despicable. And not only that, but he then doubled down on it afterwards. So we have this from People magazine. You could see the quote that this was obviously a joke about their age difference and the look of joy we see on her face every time they're together. Well, I wouldn't call saying someone who is expecting to be widowed a joke. Like I said, you would have to be an incredibly despicable person to say that. I mean, it was a light roast joke about the fact that he's almost 80 and she's younger than I am. So again, that's not what he said. He said that she had the glow of an expectant widow. I, that literally has nothing to do necessarily with the age difference. I mean, I guess you could construe it that way, and that's why this is protected speech. I mean, I do believe in the First Amendment, and I do believe that that's why he phrased it in this way in the first place. But then, yeah, I mean, he goes in and he does say that it was a traumatic event, which I'm glad that he at least did that. But not only did he say that, but afterwards, he goes, but if you want us to believe that a joke I made 3 days before this dinner had any effect on anything that happened, well, maybe you should look into this psychic lady too. And he was talking about Caroline Leavitt, because I don't know necessarily how long before the actual White House Correspondents' Dinner it was. I believe it was the same day. There was a clip of her that went viral of her saying that there were going to be shots fired.
This man is ready to rumble, is he not?
He is ready to rumble. I will tell you, this speech tonight will be classic Donald J. Trump. It'll be funny. It'll be entertaining. There will be some shots fired tonight in the room. So everyone should tune in. It's going to be really great. I'm looking forward to hearing it.
I mean, let me just make this clear, because if you're a leftist, I'm assuming that you don't understand how phrases of speech actually work. I mean, when you're talking about jokes, because she said that there were going to be jokes and there were going to be shots fired. So you could see what she said. I mean, it's very clear that this was just a regular phrase, because people use the phrase shots fired all the time. I mean, it's not even controversial. I mean, people say that when they're roasting each other all the time. But apparently that's at the same level of calling Melania Trump an expectant widow, which is even more despicable, considering that Trump has already had several major assassination attempts on his life, being shot once, as well as the rhetoric being used by people like Jimmy Kimmel, explicitly calling for violence against, or explicitly or implicitly, because I will say I don't believe Jimmy Kimmel has explicitly called for violence against Trump or conservatives, but he has implicitly implied it with some of the terms that he's used to describe them. And obviously this has rightly led to criticism of Jimmy Kimmel, and personally I believe that he should have his show terminated over this, because there's, like I said, he got hired to be a comedian. Comedians aren't supposed to be doing politics. I mean, if you want to go do politics on the side, then that's fine, but comedy is supposed to unite people, not divide people, and that's all that he does. He's just been dividing people, so he needs to lose his job, hopefully go into an early retirement, and that should be, I will clarify this, that should be ABC doing that, but we'll see if the FCC gets involved. I wouldn't be very in favor of that happening, but he definitely needs to be let go. But on top of that, not only did we have this whole Jimmy Kimmel situation, but we also had the perennial Republicans pounce story. This one was out by Politico. I'm sorry. This was after the White House Correspondents' Dinner shooting, Republicans blame Dems for political rhetoric. Well, yeah, I mean, when you're calling Trump and conservatives fascists, Nazis, the worst people ever, they're taking away your rights, they're killing people, they're putting children in cages. I do think that your rhetoric is to blame, because you're justifying and basically incentivizing political violence. And then when political violence does occur, you celebrate it, as we saw in at least three Trump assassination attempts, as well as the successful assassination of Charlie Kirk. We saw leftists celebrating in the streets. So tell me, how is that Republicans pouncing when we're observing reality? But I mean, let's even look in this article just so you can see how absolutely evil this is. I mean, this here, second paragraph. It's a playbook Republicans forged in the aftermath of the 2 assassination attempts against Trump in 2024, when early calls for unity gave way to accusations that Democrats had spent years stoking threats of violence against the president by casting him as a threat to democracy. Well, yeah, when you have one side that is attempting to kill high-ranking politicians on the other side, and you're consistently calling them Nazis, fascists, threats to democracy, the worst person ever. Yeah, that's what happens. And I don't think that's a playbook, because you can't unify with people who want you dead. I mean, genuinely, like, there's no way to have a marketplace of ideas if somebody keeps on shooting up the marketplace. That's from Michael Knowles. That's a direct quote. I mean, you can't live with these people if they are absolutely trying to kill you. And it's supposedly the Republicans' fault for observing that reality, which is, like I said, absolutely insane. But luckily, at least to some extent, some people are recognizing this. I mean, you could see this in this NPR clip now.
So what are we finding, and what are you finding as you've looked into the suspect?
So the defendant was an educator. He worked with high school kids in Torrance, California. And you know, Scott, there have been news reports quoting members of his family who say that he was a radical leftist. NPR has not independently confirmed these reports. But these claims were also circulating on social media platforms. And Jared Holt says there's some dissonance there. He's with Open Measures, which is a company that tracks online threats and narratives.
You know, you're seeing some of the typical, well, it's the radical left and their rhetoric. They need to cool it down. But then you look at the social media profiles that have been attributed to the suspect, and they're really not that radical.
And all of that is kind of alarming in its own way. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, many acts of political violence that we've seen in this country tie to false narratives, where the conspiracies sometimes push people to act violently by creating a sense of urgency around some supposed crisis. This wasn't that. Yes, he was using terms like rapist or pedophile in reference to the president, but honestly, his content falls into a kind of mainstream left now, Scott. It didn't show any sign that he might be swimming in radical leftist waters or fixated on violence as a solution to his grievances. I think what's most troubling about this one from the people I've interviewed is just that this person's admittedly thin online presence and writings paint a picture of a pretty normal guy with views that are quite common in America. It doesn't appear that there was any so-called radicalization. And so I think, through the court case, many will be looking for indications of what could have tipped him into an alleged, plan for violence.
That is NPR's Adet Youssef. Thanks so much.
Okay, so you heard them in that clip. This shooter, or attempted assassin, because he did shoot one of the Secret Service agents. Luckily, nothing serious, and he didn't injure anybody else. But he didn't espouse any radical rhetoric. And obviously, NPR is a left-wing source. They are funded by the government, so it makes sense that they would want to support the government. But even past that, they've been quite radical. But what I find so funny about this is that they say that these are mainstream beliefs. And to me, that should make them realize that if this radical belief that led him to try to kill the president and members of his staff, if that's a mainstream belief, then your side is the radical side. I mean, like, the lack of logic that these people have is absolutely insane. Like, they cannot look at themselves in the mirror and recognize that they're the problem. And I understand psychologically you don't ever want to believe that you're the problem, and that you tend to always view yourself as the hero. But, I mean, this is at least the third assassination attempt, because we don't necessarily know if that kid who basically he went to Mar-a-Lago with a gas canister and a shotgun, if he was actually attempting to assassinate Trump. But at least 3 assassination attempts. And this guy supposedly had not radical rhetoric. He didn't follow any of that. Well, yeah, that's because you guys are radical, and your radicalism has become mainstream. And that's why, like I said, anybody espousing, engaging in, supporting this kind of rhetoric needs to be excluded from public life entirety. Polite society, however you want to phrase it. Because you cannot have a functioning society with people like this. If you have people, let's say leftists, because I mean, this happened in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination, where we had school teachers celebrating in the streets. One of them was a Chicago teacher. She was making fun of people, pointing a fake gun at her neck and then shooting herself. And that was supposed to be, she's a teacher. She is teaching your kids. How can you trust that she would protect your kids, or that she actually cares about your kids if you believe in the opposite political belief, if you're a conservative. That's because you can't. You also can't trust your waitresses or waiters when you're at restaurants if they're celebrating the death of their political opponents, because how do you know that they're not going to try to poison your food? There's no trust that exists in this society. I mean, even if you go to a doctor's office, are you supposed to be afraid that your doctor is going to kill you or intentionally have complications with your surgeries? Because that's not a society I want to live in. And that's the society that we're currently allowing to happen because nobody's cracking down on these people. And there are existing laws that we can do that. We can target them with incitement of violence. If they haven't committed any crimes, then what you need to do is you need to pressure their jobs to actually fire them, terminate them. Because, like I said, there is no trust in a society that allows these types of people to celebrate or call for violence against their political opposition. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't see that. But that's really what we need to do, because, and I'll get into a little bit more, but we're on a very bad track for the country right now. And this is one of the few things that we can do to at least save us somewhat. I don't even know if that'll save us entirely. But on top of that, we also had the top Democrat official, Jamie Raskin. I believe he's a representative for Maryland. He was being interviewed by Dana Bash on CNN, and he was basically asked about his rhetoric, and his response, what rhetoric? So let's hear the clip now.
You have, and as many of your fellow Democrats, have used some heated rhetoric against the president. And do you think twice about that when something like this happens?
But what rhetoric do you have in mind?
Just talking about some of the fact that he, is terrible for this country and so on and so forth. I understand that that's your democratic right, but overall, do you
I have
a
no
responsibility?
personal problem with Donald Trump at all. I mean, I talk about the policies of this administration, the authoritarianism like we saw on display in Minneapolis, where 2 of our citizens were gunned down in the streets simply for exercising their First Amendment rights. Renee Good, Alex Preddy, and others have, died in custody. I'm talking about policies. I don't personalize it, and I certainly have never called the press the enemy of the people. I think the press are the people's best friend, and that's why it's written right there into the First Amendment. We need the press to be a vigilant watchdog against every level of government, federal, state, local, all of it.
Yeah. I mean, this is just absolutely absurd. What rhetoric are you talking about? I don't use any radical rhetoric or extreme rhetoric, and my colleagues don't either. Well, in case you don't believe me that they have, let's go through some of the instances where this is actually the case. So, I mean, first, this is from April 30th, 2025. So this was about a year ago. So it was Raskin's statement on the Trump's first 100 days of quote unquote chaos, fear, and calamity. This is like the first sentence. In just 100 days, Donald Trump has taken a chainsaw to our economy, to our Constitution, and to the livelihoods of my constituents in Maryland's 8th Congressional District. First sentence of his statement, already calling Trump a threat to essentially our democracy, but realistically saying that he is absolutely throwing out the Constitution, which arguably that's been happening for decades or even centuries, depending on how you want to look at it, which I do agree with. And that has been happening for centuries. But Trump hasn't done anything novel in terms of political power. I guess the tariffs are somewhat novel, but even that was based on precedent from the early days. I believe it was the 1780s is when they started doing that. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff he's done is entirely precedented, but this is clearly Jamie Raskin violating, he took a chainsaw to our Constitution. So that's not radical rhetoric. I mean, maybe that's not radical rhetoric. Let's see what Hakeem Jeffries, this is the House Minority Speaker, says. Well, he says after Virginia approved a new congressional map, or Virginia voters approved a new congressional map that would basically eliminate Republicans' voice in all elections there, because it turns it from a 6 Democrat to 5 Republican into a 10 Democrat to 1 Republican state. He says that we need maximum warfare everywhere, all the time. Well, that seems kind of extreme. I mean, calling for warfare against supposedly your countrymen, who you are supposed to care about. I mean, that doesn't make much sense there. And I would consider that quite radical. And not only did he say this, but he was even asked after this White House Correspondents' Dinner if he regretted any of his statements. And he says, no, I stand by it. He says that he wishes to, he says, you can continue to criticize me for it, but I don't give a bleep about your criticism. Yeah, so he's doubling down on the fact that he wants maximum warfare, which any reasonable person would assume that he's talking about physical warfare, like killing or assassination. I mean, and this is coming from the top levels of the Democrat Party. Like I said, he's the minority speaker of the House right now. I mean, just absolutely insane. And not only that, we also had Seth Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts. He had this clip from CNN.
Believe that the Secretary of Defense is guilty of war crimes?
Absolutely. I mean, he's clearly behind the operation to shoot all these boats in the Caribbean when it's very unclear that we actually have any confirmation that these so-called narco-terrorists, a term the administration invented to justify this action, are even on the boats. I mean, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that these are just fishermen, getting jobs, piloting these boats, trying to feed their families. There's been press reporting on some of these individuals who've been killed who are clearly not war criminals. And on top of that, we then have the strike where they came back and hit it again, a double tap, just purely to kill these survivors who were clinging to wreckage. It's interesting, Aaron, another historical analogy. Back in World War II, the Allies tried Nazi submarine captains for doing this exact same thing. And guess what the conclusion was? They got executed. Listen to that, Mr. Secretary.
Seth Moulton literally calls for the execution of Pete Hegseth. This is the absolute absurdity of, well, I would like to say double standards or hypocrisy, but they don't care. They know that these are double standards because the standards only apply to conservatives. They don't apply to leftists. But yeah, they call for violence and then claim that this is a both sides issue, which it objectively is not. But I mean, like I said, we can go on and on about this, but we also had a few other prominent Democrats talking about this, and I'm not going to play all of them. I sourced quite a few clips of this, but I don't want this to be a strictly clips show. I obviously want to give my political commentary on this. So the only one I'm going to play right now is the clip from Destiny. He's a leftist streamer, and just to be clear, I did have to take this from Steven Crowder's show because I went to actually pull the clip from Destiny's channel himself, and his channel was deleted. So I don't know what's up with that, but here's the clip now.
He's very clear. Conservatives need to be afraid to die because that's good for the country. Something here.
You need conservatives to be afraid of getting killed when they go to events so that they look to their leadership to turn down the temperature. The issue is right now, they don't feel like there's any fear. Like, I don't know. It's like memes. It's just.
That is completely untrue, verifiably. I'll prove it in the second play.
Memes to everybody, I guess. I don't know, bro. I don't know. I don't care. I'm playing video games. Okay, I'm done today. I don't give a God, it's gonna be so fucking gay if I get killed in the next 2 months of shit I'm doing. Well, the cuck shit out here, please don't anybody make any actual the most cucked, weak-ass bullshit speeches on my side. God, if it happens, holy shit, I'm gonna make a death note before I go out to go live and not. God, it's so cucked. It's so optics cucked.
Okay, so from the people who are supposedly peaceful, they claim that they're the peaceful ones. He says that conservatives need to be afraid to speak out so that way they look to their leadership to calm down the rhetoric. Tell me, which one has the radical rhetoric? The side that is literally calling for violence against conservatives, or the side that says, maybe we shouldn't do that? I mean, this is just absolutely absurd. And like I showed last week, obviously Hassan Piker is very guilty of this. I didn't want to pull a clip from him again because like I said, I showed it either last week or the week before. But I would say definitely him and Destiny absolutely need to be charged with incitement of violence. I think that Hassan Piker should be deported or denaturalized if possible, because obviously he has no place in this country if he's going to call for violence against people, politicians, because he's done that against Rick Scott. Was a prominent one that he called for violence against. Obviously, he has the let the streets run red with capitalist blood. That was another one of his sayings. He also said that America deserved 9/11. So this man has no actual love of America or any reason to realistically be here. So I think that we should give him what he supposedly wants and return him to another country. Or I believe he's from Turkey. So we could send him back over there and he can celebrate that, because it's obviously a much better country than America, according to him. So, yeah, we got to do that. But another thing I want to talk about, because I talked about this in one of my first videos that went up about 2 or 3 months ago now. Obviously, a lot of leftists, because I actually heard this when I put up my statement about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, because so just for you guys to know, I don't get news from 6 p.m. on Saturday to 6 a.m. on Monday. I observe the Sabbath then, so I don't, like I said, no social media, no news, so you won't ever see any stuff from me unless I schedule it in advance. But generally, I try not to do that. So I put up my post on Monday, and I got a bunch of comments telling me that political violence is exclusively right-wing, or it's mostly right-wing. And like I said, in one of my previous videos, I've already debunked this, because a lot of the supposedly right-wing violence is actually not right-wing. It's more identitarian, if anything. And in addition to that, all left-wing violence is reclassified, so that way it's not classified as left-wing violence. But I saw this clip from Batya Ungar-Sargon, and so I'll play it now.
Aldo brought up this idea that the left and the right are equal when it comes to calls for violence or acts of violence. You have done an amazing job of digging through the data, and what did you find?
All right, so Geraldo, see if you find this compelling,
Okay.
all right? So it seems to me that there are 3 main sources that you hear a lot from the mainstream media that allegedly prove that the problem we have right now of political violence is a both sides problem. There's the Cato Institute, there's the Prosecuting Project out of the University of Cincinnati, and then there's the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Now, these are all always shared by the likes of The Economist, the Wall Street Journal today shared Center for Strategic and International Studies. The problem is when you dig down into that data, it is so deeply flawed. Let me just give you a few examples, okay? The Prosecuting Project, supposed to list all of the acts of political violence in America, does not list Charlie Kirk's assassination, does not list Trump's assassination attempts, does not list any George Floyd violence. 24 Americans lost their lives during those riots, not listed. But every white nationalist who's a drug dealer, that gets listed. So they list 33 white Aryan Nation people who had a meth lab. This is political violence because they happen to be white nationalists. All right, Cato does not list the 9/11 victims, does not list any George Floyd violence. Center for Strategic and International Studies, where does it get its data from? The ADL, highly partisan, and the Southern, which just was revealed to have allegedly been funding the very racists that they were supposed to be fighting. And finally, I just have to mention this, the Center for Strategic and International Studies has, in its methodology section, it says all anti-Semitism is right-wing. Any attacks on Jews or Jewish institutions, they reclassified it. If it was in the name of Palestinians, they reclassified it as ethno-nationalist. So by their definition, there's no such thing as left-wing anti-Semitism, which we all know is just nonsense. This is the data. It is flawed. Shame on the Wall Street Journal and shame on The Economist, because they're giving a flawed view. And I totally agree with Katie. We can't, it would be so nice to say, kumbaya, we all share the problem. You cannot fix a problem if you are lying about what it is.
Yeah, so she has a great analysis on it, going through it, like, almost every single instance of political violence that is left-wing is either miscategorized or just completely excluded from the data sets. While everything that is right-wing is, or anything that's even close to being right-wing, like for example, if you have a supposedly like a Nazi, a neo-Nazi, however you want to describe them, who beats up his wife. That's considered political violence in these data sets, which is objectively false. I mean, it has nothing to do with politics, but it's counted as political violence because it benefits leftists. And that's who's really conducting these studies. And it's also interesting, too, because you hear all these people saying that how right-wing violence is so much worse than left-wing violence. But tell me, if that's true, where is all the right-wing violence? I mean, you claim that right-wing violence is everywhere, but the only example that you ever use is January 6th, which is absolutely absurd because in that instance, literally the only person who died was a Trump supporter who was shot by a trigger-happy cop. I mean, it's literally quite absurd. And the other thing, too, is with last week's revelations that the SPLC was allegedly funding Nazi sympathetic organizations and white supremacist organizations, it actually makes more sense to classify any of those supposedly instances of right-wing violence as left-wing violence, because conservatives wholeheartedly condemn it, and it's not a mainstream political belief whatsoever. I mean, if you could look at polls for this, but they don't care about that. They just want to lump it in because it increases right-wing political violence and gives them the narrative they want. And I talked about this last week with the SPLC. They use this, they create this data set, so that way media companies can run with it and promote a narrative. Then those narratives are used to push the idea that political violence is on both sides. So that way you always have a scapegoat when somebody from your side inevitably attempts to kill or successfully kills somebody that is a conservative, which that's not how we're supposed to be functioning in society. And you can't properly diagnose an issue if you have people intentionally manipulating the data sets, so you cannot identify that issue and hold the people accountable for it. So that's absolutely absurd. And luckily, Trump administration is actually following through with some of these instances of political violence and actually, or threats, and holding people accountable. Because this week we had a grand jury indict James Comey for the second time. And this indictment focuses on his Instagram post of quote unquote 8647, which there are two ways to view this. You could either view it as removing an item from like a menu, or you could view it as killing somebody. Now, given that James Comey was the former director of the FBI, I am inclined to believe that he meant to kill. Now, luckily, because we have the First Amendment, which is a good thing, it's very easy for him to claim that that's not what he meant. And like I said, in this lawsuit or this indictment, you would have to prove intent. And I do think that Dan Bongino is wrong on this, because I did listen to him on it, and he thinks that this is a huge win. It is huge. I personally don't think this is going anywhere. I mean, maybe if we see more evidence of this, but it seems like it comes down to intent, and intent is incredibly difficult to prove, especially when it comes to a First Amendment issue like this. So I highly doubt that this is going to go anywhere, but at least they're trying, which is, they should be, like I said, going after significantly bigger people than this. Like I said, Destiny, Hassan Piker, just to start off with. I think there could be a case made for Hakeem Jeffries, but I think that it's close. And personally, I think that it's too political. It would not play well in the public. So I wouldn't go after that. But not only did we have this indictment of James Comey come through, which, like I said, probably won't go anywhere, we also had an indictment on the attackers of Savanah Hernandez, the Turning Point reporter, which I talked about a few weeks ago, which this is another great thing. So there were 3 individuals that were charged. They assaulted her, and 2 of them are, I believe it's, they're being charged with interference with a federally protected activity as well as assault. So that's great that they're actually holding people accountable for this. I hope that we see a lot more of this. I also think that we should see a lot more firings, like I said earlier, based on if anybody was celebrating or complaining that he missed, then yeah, we need to see more firings, because these people, like I said, have no place in polite society. You can't have a trust-based society with them in it, and that's why they need to be either locked up, pushed to the fringes. I mean, if you exclude them from society, then yes, they are going to live on the fringes, which is how a lot of extremist ideology was was operating before leftists mostly brought it back up. But in general, yeah, these people need to be excluded from public life in general. And then on top of that, because the other big thing is that you obviously have a lot of people saying that this administration does nothing. Well, something is absolutely happening this week, because we had those indictments come through, which obviously are huge in and of themselves. But we also had an indictment of a ex-advisor to Fauci, who reportedly was intentionally obscuring information by moving it from government email addresses to private email addresses. So that way, when a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, was issued to him, he wasn't required to disclose the information because it was on his personal emails as opposed to government emails. And that's essentially what this indictment is over, because obviously you can't do that. And it's alleged that these emails were related to the actual origins of COVID, because obviously it was discovered that it leaked out of a lab in Wuhan, which everybody was saying, but Fauci and the administration were denying it the whole time, which again, completely false. Like, it turned out to be false, but they were literally silencing people across social media platforms for that. So that's good that we're hopefully going to see some light in that. That indictment is pretty big. We also had an exclusive story from the Daily Wire break, where obviously we've been talking a lot about the persecution of Catholics under the Biden administration and the Catholic Church's lack of response to that. But Mary Margaret Olohan broke this story this week, where it actually turns out that the Biden DOJ attorneys were fantasizing about arresting nuns, Catholic nuns, for their actions, actually believing in the Catholic faith, which is funny because, like I said before, Biden was supposedly a Catholic. He's nominally a Catholic. I mean, I don't know how you can be a Catholic and not believe any of the stuff that the Catholic Church stands for, but that's what he says he is. I mean, right here, we can see the actual texts. So I would like to take a special assignment of finding and prosecuting them in regards to, this was based on a New York Times photo of a Catholic nun organization, the Religious Sisters, who attended the Stop the Steal rally. So that's the context of this. So it's a picture of that. This guy says, I would like to take a special assignment of finding and prosecuting them. Then I'm with you, although I'd like to prosecute any nun who still wears the head habit. Ha 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 ha. This was a text exchange between these DOJ prosecutors. Now, I don't know how saying that you want to prosecute nuns is funny in the first place. Like I said before, I mean, Jimmy Kimmel isn't funny, but even this isn't, like, Jimmy Kimmel's funnier than this. But so I don't know how this could be construed as a joke. But not only did they treat it as a joke, but they actually followed through with it by actually going after nuns, by whether it be lawsuits for in terms of the abortion instances, because they were using the FACE Act to prosecute a lot of nuns, particularly because they were working with Planned Parenthood, who would send them dossiers, like I talked about a few weeks ago. So that was pretty big news. We also had them forcing nuns in hospitals to perform abortions if needed, and what I mean by if needed is if the hospital didn't have the staff, they would require nuns to violate their oath to actually go and perform an abortion. And on top of that, they would also have them provide transgender surgeries. They actually sued various Catholic hospitals to require them to provide those procedures, which is absolutely insane and obviously a violation of the First Amendment. But the Biden administration didn't care about that. And these remnants are still here. And luckily, I mean, we have some good members in Congress, because we recently had an abortion activist on the Capitol Hill. And Brandon Gill actually had some great questions for her. And I know this gets a little bit graphic, but I do think that it's good for you guys to hear exactly what happens in abortion. So we'll play the clip now.
Advocate for abortion, for abortion policy. What's your favorite type of abortion?
I'm an advocate for patients having access to the full realm of reproductive health care.
But do you have a preferred method of abortion that you like?
I do not.
I mean, read through a couple different methods, and I want to get your take on how much you like these. The first type is called a suction abortion. This is when the cervix is dilated and a strong suction, 29 times the power of a household vacuum cleaner, tears the baby's body apart and sucks it through the hose into a container. Do you prefer that method?
I stand by my former testimony.
That sounds kind of gross, doesn't it? Sounds pretty gruesome. Do you agree? It does to me.
I stand by how I answered your question fully and accurately.
Okay, what about this one? This one is called dilation and curettage. After dilation of the cervix, a sharp looped knife is inserted into the uterus. The baby's body is cut into pieces and extracted, often by suction. Do you prefer that method?
What I believe we are here to talk about today is the FACE Act. We are not here to talk about
I'm asking
the
you, you're
legality
a
of
pro-abortion advocate. I'm asking if you prefer the dilation and curettage method.
I am a access to reproductive health care advocate.
You don't want to talk about abortion itself. Why is that?
I would prefer to talk about the reason that the committee called the hearing.
Is it because it's
freedom of
uncomfortable to talk
access.
about?
I would prefer
It should be uncomfortable.
I would prefer, if you would let me finish my statement, to talk about the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, which is
We're
what I
talking
was
about
asked to come
what
here
that
to talk
access
about.
gets. How about this one? It's called dilation and evacuation. Forceps are inserted into the uterus, grabbing and twisting the baby's body to dismember him or her. If the head is too large, it must be crushed in order to remove it. Do you prefer that method?
I would prefer to talk about the reason the hearing was called and the basis of my expert testimony.
It's uncomfortable to hear this, isn't it? It is. I think it is, because it's barbaric and evil. How about this one? It's called the saline injection. It's when a 20% salt solution is injected through the mother's abdomen into the baby's amniotic fluid. The baby's skin is burned off. The baby ingests the solution and dies of salt poisoning, dehydration, and hemorrhaging of the brain. Do you prefer that method?
I would prefer to talk about the subject of the hearing.
This is the subject of the hearing. This is about protests outside of abortion clinics. I'm asking you about abortion.
I stand by my prior testimony.
Okay. I wouldn't want to talk about this either if I were you, because it is barbaric and evil.
So there, you heard him. He was asking her about what her favorite method of abortion was and describing them to her, which I do think is extremely powerful, because I was actually out in Nashville a few months ago with Young Americans for Freedom, because they had their Freedom at 250 conference there. And I actually got to hear the story of, her name is Abby Johnson. So she used to work in Planned Parenthood, and she used to actually help people with abortions, get abortions. And she described it to me, and that was radical. I mean, I've always been anti-abortion, pretty much my whole life. Obviously, I'm a Catholic, so it's against my faith to be in favor of abortion. But I mean, that radicalized me even further, just hearing how absolutely dehumanizing it is. And that's why I do think that it's important for people to actually hear what happens in an abortion, so that way they realize that it is killing somebody. I mean, I don't know how you can describe it as anything but that, but people will try to do that all the time. And obviously these radicals keep on pushing this absolutely insane policy of abortion up to and after birth, depending on who you talk to, with absolutely no restrictions, which, like I said, is absurd, because the reasonable position, the moderate position, is abortion with restrictions. And that's what a lot of Republicans nowadays hold, which, like I said, I think that's wrong. But I would much rather have less abortions than more. So anything I can do to limit the number of abortions occurring, I will be in favor of. And that certainly is. So that's that. But like I said, they have a lot of radical policies, especially on that. And it's really starting to hurt Democrats, because this week we actually had a Harvard-Harris poll come out, and this tends to be a left-leaning poll, or a somewhat left-leaning poll, from what I've been reading. And it puts, on the generic congressional ballot, Democrats and Republicans at a 50-50 chance of winning the election, which is crazy, because historical precedent would say that if one political party has unified government, so all three branches of government, then the opposite political party would tend to reclaim the House in the midterms. This is, like, I've been saying this for weeks now, probably months now, realistically, that you cannot count the Republicans out. And either way, if you're a Republican, show up and vote in these elections, because there is a very good chance that we could win, but we need your vote. So make sure that wherever you are, if you are legally eligible to vote, make sure you're registered to vote, and then actually show up on voting day, because we need your vote. Election day, we need your vote, and that I mean that's the only way you can win elections. We got to show up to the polls and push for our agenda, because we can realistically make this significantly higher than 50%, but we need the turnout to do that. Speaking of elections, though, we also had a huge Supreme Court case this week. We had, well, before I get to the U.S. Supreme Court, I will go to the Virginia Supreme Court, because this one I do think is a bit more pressing. And this was regarding the Virginia redistricting case, where they decided that they were going to allow a temporary block on the redistricting, obviously, because the lower court essentially claimed that they needed to block it because it was unconstitutional. I believe I went over it it was either last week or the week before. It was right after it passed. That according to Virginia's own constitution, that was they had added an amendment in 2020 that was passed by Democrats. It was almost unanimous that they would not allow for redistricting outside of every 10 years with the census, because they didn't want political people gerrymandering the state. And then they decided to go ahead and do it anyways. But this is huge, because at least this is a temporary block, so it is still going through the court system, and it will likely eventually reach the Supreme Court, the Virginia Supreme Court, which hopefully it does. And I really hope that the Virginia Supreme Court recognizes that this is absolutely absurd and they cannot let it stand. But we'll see. And while that was actually a huge win for Republicans, we also had another even bigger win than that in regards to, this was Louisiana v. Calais, where this was a case basically questioning gerrymandering and whether or not the Voting Rights Act allowed for the creation of quote-unquote majority-minority districts, which means that the majority of the population are a national minority. So, for example, you would have a district strictly dedicated to Black people, Latinos, like whatever race you want to come up with. That was what people interpreted the Voting Rights Act as meaning. Obviously, this is absurd, because the whole concept of districts is meant to consolidate a group of people that have similar values together, so that way they have a representative that actually represents them, what they want, their values, and everything like that. But when you single it out based on race, all that you get is the race of the person. Like, that's all that matters, which is absolutely absurd. And obviously we've been fighting that since the civil rights movement, and we were largely successful until Democrats decided to start pushing the idea that we actually need to be aware of race, and that race is actually the primary characteristic that we should be identifying based on, which, like I said, is absolutely absurd. And one thing that I find so funny about this is that obviously the Supreme Court ruled that you can't have race-based gerrymandering, because that's absurd. And they didn't strike down the whole Voting Rights Act, which this was pretty much the last portion of it that was still active. But what they said was that no, discrimination on terms of race happens against all races, and it's not just strictly limited to minority groups, and that's why you can't have a strictly minority district. So that was great news. And I've actually seen, like, some of the people I talk to in real life, they are very, very wrong on this, and overly upset about this. And I put out a post that I thought was quite funny, because it's literally what they're claiming, is that the people who are saying that this is violating, this is eliminating the voting rights of minorities. Well, if you take that to its logical conclusion, then that means that the only way for minorities to actually have voting rights is for them to have their own separate districts from every other person in the country that is of the majority group. So they're separate districts, but they have to have equal representation. So they're separate but equal. Who were the people who were saying that before? I believe that those were the people that were against the civil rights movement, which ironically was also Democrats. Yeah, the party supposedly switched, yet the Democrats still stand for the same stuff today. They want Black-only spaces. I mean, this is a policy that they've been supporting. They want Black-only teams. Like, I mean, and this is blatantly racist, but they bill it as, oh, these places are going to be either better, higher quality, or equal to the other people's race, or I guess realistically the white races, which again, segregation is a bad thing. And these people are just blatantly flaunting their racism, which I find hilarious, because these people are the same people who claim to be anti-racists, but they don't care because they are racists. There's no such thing as anti-racism. There is just racism. And that's kind of what the whole thing with the SPLC was. I mean, they literally they supposedly fought against racism while simultaneously funding it, because racism isn't as big a problem now as it used to be, because we actually have succeeded. We have made progress, and that's a good thing. We should be celebrating that. We shouldn't be putting people down because they're white, because their ancestors potentially, not even guaranteed, had slaves, and those slaves may or may not have been black, because there were also white slaves that people had. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. But I mean, this, like I said, getting past that though, this ruling could basically give Republicans a permanent majority for the next 14 years. That's how revolutionary this is, because if you look, I have it on screen now, this is from Open Source Zone, you have two maps of the South. So you have the current map where you can see there are several, quite a few actually, Democrat districts across the South. And then the plausible scenario, because most of those Democrat districts right now are the result of this Voting Rights Act policy, that you were allowed to create majority minority districts. And in fact, you were forced to. So if all these states redistrict, we could see, some estimates go up to 30. Some say, like this one only says plus 12 for Republicans. I've seen up to 30 increased seats for Republicans based on this single ruling, which would be absolutely huge. And like I've said this before, if Republicans could last out until 2030, at that point, we are going to see, it's going to be an almost guaranteed Republican supermajority until 2040. It's just the way the math works out, because we had the failed census in 2020, which we already know they messed up and that they never corrected it. But that would have resulted in many Democrat districts actually losing seats and being eliminated and being added into Republican districts or Republican states. But in 2030, if we do that and prevent illegals from being counted in the census, it's going to be huge. It's the Democrat Party is almost going to die. Like, it's basically going to be dead. But again, and I have to add this caveat in, that only happens if Republicans win every single election up until 2030. We need to do that if you want to keep on winning. Because if Democrats win this midterm, they're going to ruin Trump's legacy, and they're going to win in 28. That's realistically what's going to happen. If Democrats don't win in 26, or they don't win this year in 26, then they still have a chance to win in 28. And if they win in 28, then they get 2030, and they can change the laws. We don't want that. No, we need to make it through 2030, and even then, we need to try to win. We need to do our best to win in 2030, because if we win the presidency in 28, that's great, but we still need a Congress to actually be able to enforce or to actually create these laws and manipulate the census, so that way we aren't counting illegals in the census. Because if Democrats win that, they're never going to pass that, and we're still going to be counting illegals in the census. But we need to make sure that we win these next three elections are the biggest elections of any person's lifetime right now. I mean, genuinely. I mean, I could go on and on about that for a long time, but let's get back to wins this week. So those were obviously some court wins, but we also had some administrative wins in terms of various organizations, because this week we actually had several fraud centers that were targeted by the FBI, and for fraud, obviously they were being raided in order to gather evidence for these charges against them, because obviously Nick Shirley a few months ago now had an expose on a lot of the fraud centers in Minnesota, and this is where these centers were actually being raided. But I do want to highlight again, because pretty much the whole theme of this show is how radical the Democrats are. I know this is almost every single one of my shows. I really don't mean to make it like that. If they could somehow moderate, I would cover that, because I hate talking about how radical they are, because they just keep on pushing it further and further. Like there's no limit to how radical they're willing to go. But I mean, they literally have such misleading headlines for this story, because we have this from The Guardian. Federal agents again target Minnesota amid alleged fraud crackdown at daycares. So now, there are two ways to interpret this, but the most common interpretation is that this is a alleged fraud crackdown. And what that means is that they are allegedly cracking down on fraud. And if you know what happened in Minnesota, that was where a lot of the ICE raids were, and that's where we had 2 citizens killed. That was Renee Good and Alex Preddy, which, like I said before, legally it was justified. If you want to argue the morals of it, go ahead, do that. I'm not going to debate you on that, because we're not going to reach any common ground on that. But legally, it was completely valid. But so they had a lot of problems there. So that's why they're using this language, because they want to manipulate their base, because The Guardian is a leftist outlet. They want to manipulate their base into thinking that this is more ICE enforcement, that they're coming there to target civilians, which is objectively not true. And the only way they can get away with this is because of the second reading, which is that this is alleged fraud that they're cracking down on, which is what's actually happening. It's alleged fraud. But they don't want their viewers to actually know that. So that was absolutely absurd to me, and I was really upset with that. But then we also had this from the CNN. So this one they actually did, depending on how you want to look at it, a better job on the title. So the title for this one is Federal Law Enforcement Raid Businesses in Minnesota Fraud Investigation. So they're just raiding businesses. It implies that they're just raiding businesses left and right. There's no rhyme or reason to it. But obviously there is. And not only is that title not like it's better in my mind than the Guardian article title, but it's still pretty bad. But in this one, they explicitly, I mean, you could see in the quote, so there were 22 federal search warrants executed, including raids at daycares, businesses, and homes. Okay, that's fine. That's what's actually happening. But the allegations of fraud were cited by the Trump administration as the justification for sending thousands of immigration agents into Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota at large earlier this year, which in turn spurred protests from residents in the Twin Cities. The deaths of U.S. citizens Renee Good and Alex Preddy intensified criticism against the administration's immigration enforcement and eventually led to the Department of Homeland Security decreasing the amount of agents in the region. Now, that was not the justification for increased ICE presence. The original reason why ICE showed up was because they have a significant population of illegals in that state, because they have a huge Somali population, which, whether you like it or not, they are legal citizens. But they're typically, when you have legal citizens of a certain nationality, illegal citizens of that nationality tend to pocket together with them. So that was the initial reason why they went into Minnesota. It was also because they had sanctuary city laws there. But they did that, and then they experienced large pockets of Antifa resistance. And that resistance, including people like Alex Preddy and Renee Good, who were obstructing the actual enforcement of immigration operations there, those people are the reason why they had more ICE people, or more ICE members sent there, because they needed more people to actually have security, because they were being attacked and brutalized by these protesters. I mean, and this is why you cannot trust just about anything that any of these outlets tell you, because they just blatantly lie. Like I said, the fraud was not the justification for sending more ICE agents there. It was the violence that was being directed at these ICE agents. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. And then I obviously, because I wanted to pull up a source that actually has the story, it's CBS News, because they're probably the best moderate outlet that I've seen. But I mean, you could see, let's see. Yeah, I mean, it was just a COVID-era fraud scheme. They were basically... So there were no arrests made. They targeted about 20 childcare centers, like I said. In the other one, there were 22 that were 22 warrants were executed. Here, no one was arrested in the raids. Obviously, this was a huge difference from what happened during Operation Metro Search, which was the whole ICE operation in Minnesota. And these were targeting COVID-era fraud schemes, which we've known about for a long time, but Nick Shirley did a lot to actually bring to light with his expose on it. So we saw that. And then, of course, Tim Walz decided that he was going to take credit for this. So this was his post, his initial post on these operations. If you commit fraud in Minnesota, you're going to get caught. And that's exactly what we saw today. We catch criminals when state and federal agencies share information. Joint investigations work, and securing justice depends on it. Now, what's funny about this is there's several reasons why this is funny. To start off with, Governor Walz and I believe it was Jacob Fry, he was the mayor of Minneapolis, they explicitly ordered their police officers to not work with ICE. So, I mean, he's kind of undermining his statement there already. But not only that, when Nick Shirley did his expose on the fraud, he called him a white supremacist. And I'll play that clip for you right now.
The way, well-deserved. All these people are finding it and finding you and all the good work that you do. But Governor Tim Walz is pushing back on the investigations into the Somali community over the massive welfare fraud that's happened under his watch. Take a look at this.
This is what happens when they target communities for their own benefit. This is what happens when they scapegoat. And this is what happens when they no longer hide the idea of white supremacy.
So apparently Nick Shirley is a white supremacist for finding fraud, but Tim Walz is the hero here because he worked with federal agencies to actually root out this fraud, which I highly doubt. And what I find even funnier about this is that Cash ratioed him. And if you're older and you don't know what ratio means, that means that you get more likes than the person whose original post you're commenting on. So Cash's post, come again? This FBI and DOJ with our DHS partners drafted and executed every search warrant today, but go ahead and take credit for our work while we smoke out the fraud plaguing Minnesota under your governorship. Because this all happened under Tim Walz, and there's even allegations that him and his attorney general aided and abetted these people because they knew about it in advance. And these allegations are actually why Tim Walz is no longer seeking re-election. So it's the delusion of these people, and they think that they can get away with it. I mean, if you have any common sense, if you have any regard for the truth, you can blatantly see that these people are lying and that it's just not true. But I mean, luckily we still have people who believe in truth, and that's how we're able to expose this stuff. And that's why I do this, so you guys can know what's actually going on. But another huge thing that regarding DHS that happened this week, and this was last night, I was actually at an event last night, so I wasn't able to put much stuff up about it, and I forgot about it for most of the day. But we had the end of the DHS shutdown, which was caused by Democrats, because the Democrats decided that they didn't want to fund DHS because they wanted to hurt ICE and CBP, which were already funded through 2029 in the One Big Beautiful Bill. So, I mean, they were already grandstanding for literally no reason. This was, if anything, these funds that would be allocated to them would be additional funds that were not needed for operation, but were just basically for additional expenses that may come up. But they were holding it up. So, and I talked about this. This hurt Coast Guard members. It hurt TSA, which obviously we interact with TSA all the time when we're going on flights. They're probably one of the most important security agencies for the average American, aside from the police force. But yeah, so we finally passed that, and the way that this passed, and just to be clear, upon initial inspection, I was kind of aggravated about this because I read it and they said they weren't including ICE or CBP funding in this bill, and I was mad because I was like, why are we giving in to the Democrats' demands? It turns out that we aren't, because that was actually how some even conservative leading outlets were reporting it, and that's not true. Yes, the bill that passed and that Trump signed doesn't include funding for ICE and CBP, so that is true. But there's also a second bill that's going through right now, going through the reconciliation process, which requires only 51 votes instead of a majority or a supermajority with 60 votes. So there's no filibuster in it. It's a reconciliation package in the Senate that would provide full funding to ICE and CBP that they requested. But to close out, we have yet another win. So obviously the nothing ever happens people are just not like, you have to be blind to the news this week to believe that nothing ever happens. As we had ATF as the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, which most of the stuff that they do now is related to firearms regulation, which is a violation of the Second Amendment, but I won't get into that now. They issued 34 new rules, they proposed 34 new rules, which will hopefully go into effect. They're in a public comment period right now. And I'm a big Second Amendment advocate. I was actually just at the gun store earlier today looking around for myself. But yeah, I mean, this is great because some of the stuff that is supposedly going to be changing is obviously we had the I believe it was the One Big Beautiful Bill removed the $200 tax on suppressors. And I believe it was also for SBRs. I don't remember if the tax was removed from SBRs as well. But you still need to file the tax stamp. Now, one of the rules that was proposed is that they're going to change the process related to that, which is heavily suspected to be that they're going to completely remove that tax stamp process from it because the NFA, National Firearms Act, was passed under FDR. And this act actually, because they actually believed that you couldn't take guns from people because the Second Amendment clearly states that, they didn't do that. Instead, they just put a tax that nobody could pay on these weapons that they deemed to be dangerous. And now that was eliminated under the One Big Beautiful Bill. Like I said, it went from $200 to $0, but you still have to file a tax stamp. But since it's no longer constitutional because you can't tax something and not take money from it, it's currently being challenged in court. I don't recall exactly where. I know there are a few lawsuits going on around this, but it's looking like it's going to get struck down, and they're taking the preemptive action of removing that, which is great. So that means that if your state allows it, which hopefully will be changing soon, you'll be able to own a suppressor or SBR without registering with the federal government. You won't need to file that paperwork every single year like you currently need to, which is absolutely huge. And it sets the precedent that states that do have bans on quote unquote SBRs, short barreled rifles, or a suppressor will be unconstitutional because I don't know how the federal government can't regulate it, but the state government somehow can. Especially when the Second Amendment is so clear. But that's all I've got for today. I'm hoping that I have a few more things that I'd like to show you guys soon. So we'll see. I'm still working out some dates on how to get the stuff recorded. But I hope that you like what I do here. I've said this before. I do this for free. I don't get paid to do this. So if you could please like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate it. Share it with people just so we can get more people actually in the know of what's going on in politics. And they can actually understand that there are different perspectives and get a better reading on what's happening. Thank you, and I'll see you next week on the Ben Corriveau Show.